Welcome back. It is 9:28 a.m. This is News and Views on Salam Media with me, Julie Ali, this Wednesday morning. We're now going to be joined by anti-apartheid activist Professor Saths Cooper, and we're going to be talking about the TRC. My goodness, I really thought that that situation was done and dusted. But apparently not. We understand that the Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, that's of course Andrew Snell, has acknowledged that the pace of finalizing the TRC matters is not moving at the desired speed. The department and the NPA have presented an update to Parliament's Justice Committee on the progress or no progress made on all TRC cases. Good morning to you, Professor. Welcome to the program. And this indeed is very worrying, is it not?
Yes, it is very worried because these ought to have been dealt with a long time ago. And it seems that in the last few years, there's been a special head appointed to deal with this matter. It's also tragic that only 1 in 4 seem to have been finalized. So it's generally the kind of malaise and lack of urgency that we see in our society in nearly all these departments that are supposed to serve the public. And the important thing about this is it concerns the terrible crimes of the past. You'll recall that the United Nations found that apartheid was a crime against humanity and consistently kept that position until the dawn of democracy. And it seems that the people who are invested with these issues don't have the ability, the will, or the desire to want to see finality in this matter.
And it's really a sad state of affairs simply because we are 30 years into our democracy and we shouldn't still be discussing something that should have been addressed ages ago, and to allow those families closure and for them to move on. Let me share with you what Advocate Rodney de Kock had to say about the matter. He is, of course, the MPA's Deputy National Director. He goes on to say that progress on these matters is slow because they have very unique challenges. For example, documents that we need are often destroyed. Reconstructions have to look at secondary evidence where they don't have the originals, loss of dockets and inquest documents. We rely on expert evidence in relation to the reconstruction of crime scenes and to give evidence regarding the cause of death and ballistics. Lots of expert evidence required in these matters. Now, in my mind, I could be on the wrong track here, but I thought that was what the TRC hearings was all about. Whilst those hearings were being conducted, all of the necessary evidence would have been collected and collated so that the matters could be finalized.
I think that that's partly true, Julie. It is, a commission is quite different from a court of law, where the burden of proof lies with the state. In a commission, facts are presented, and these may be disputed or not disputed, challenged, not challenged. The investigations leading up to the presentation of evidence, and I'm not an expert on this, in a commission does not require the high bar that a court will require, because a court will require every little bit of evidence to be presented, because you have, in this case, the irony is the state is probably having to pay for people who have committed these offenses, because they'll claim poverty and or that they were doing this in the service of the then state. Um, However, I think our law is also, if we can move on from there, law is also such that our courts are increasingly finding people liable in their own personal capacities for things. And when you hold an office of state, it does not entitle you to murder, kill. That can only, the person who's probably going to get away with that is Donald Trump. But we have a constitutional democracy here, and we have to prove. You see, alleging something is one thing, proving is another. But there should have been a seamless transfer when I think the final reports were handed to President Mandela. As about 98 or so. There were strings of recommendations, and all the evidence collated and induced in the commission at that time would have been handed over to the state. So that's where you start. You start with what you have and then look for other stuff. Unless Advocate Rodney de Kock is saying that they don't have the TRC records, that they are incomplete, somebody has been fiddling with them. We've recently heard the same kind of thing with the Zondo Commission. Now, I do know that the Zondo Commission, for instance, had all sorts of evidence and documentation and recordings and interviews and so on. In fact, they had so much evidence that you needed many rooms to fill from floor to ceiling with the kinds of documents they have. And yet, we have one department blaming another in that case, but in this one, where justice delayed is not serving anybody, particularly when it seems that sometimes when the case is ready to be prosecuted, you'll find a couple of the accused no longer around; they've died, and the result is it's almost it's an exercise that's necessary, but it's not going to give much comfort because not much will be aired really, and not much closure is going to be given to families. I think that the people dealing with it have forgotten that the persons who have been impacted, one, those tortured and killed, and I think we're dealing with the disappeared and those killed. There are a few living persons who've been tortured and who can testify. What does it say about our compassion? What does it say about our attitude to their rights? And after all, our Bill of Rights talks about justice. So are they getting justice? Clearly, no. We're always hearing these excuses. Can't we get somebody who is honest and open about where they are at so that the families know case X is not going to go anywhere? Dispense with it and move on. But to have over 120 such cases and the finalization is only of 1/4 is not on. Because what we're doing also is we are creating multiple traumas for people who ought to have been at a space where they have come to terms with certain things from this promise of democracy with dignity, integrity, justice, and so on. But very clearly, we don't have the leadership that is committed, the personnel that are capable to be able to take this forward. What we're going to get is loads of excuses, and these have been there for the last 20 years now. Do we think that much will change? I think perhaps what should be done is an engagement needs to take place between the NPA and some of the councils of the bar to say, look, Can we, like happens in other dispensations, the similar dispensations, proceed with, we borrow a lot of our procedure from. Let's get members from your fraternity to take these cases, not at the exorbitant rates that was charged by those appearing in Zondo, but at an agreed contracted rate, and expedite these cases. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And I'm afraid you or whoever else is going to come here in 5 years' time will deal almost with the same matters.
So, Professor, in response to what you've just said now, the Deputy Director General in the Justice Department, Shireen Sayed, says that compensation to those individuals has been in the form of medical and educational assistance and a once-off grant. So I'm presuming she's referring to 17,000 of just probably over 21,000 of those people were paid a once-off grant of 30,000 rands. She goes on to say that the total amount paid to date is 53 million rands. And this also has been agreed upon by the head of the NPA, and that, of course, is Shamila Batoy. She goes on to say they're doing everything in their power to bring closure to the families and the victims. But it ain't good enough, is it? They just
Well,
dragging their heels.
look, I was declared a victim of gross human rights violation twice over. And at the time, towards the end of the 90s, when those determinations were made, I declined the pursuing the cases against those persons, the terrible torturers who were security branch policemen, had applied for amnesty for. I declined to, I allowed the amnesty application to go through. Afterwards, I got calls and so on to say you're entitled to X amount. Yes, it was 30,000, and in this case, I think for the two times it would have been 60,000. Now, if you look at that period, the late 1990s, 30,000 was a decent amount of money. It wasn't by far any compensation for the gross abuse that took place, for the fact that I still suffer spinal cord and other injuries from the torture. But I declined to take on principle that amount because I felt that I'm a professional. Do I need that money? Yes, I can do with that money. But isn't it fair to put that into the pot and let somebody else who's more needy get that money? So yes, certain people would have taken that amount, but it was determined then. Shamila Batoy was nowhere on the scene. Even that spokesperson, Shireen, was not there. So to trot this out as if there's been justice done is very, very misleading. And actually, that's the kind of duplicity we see from these officials who try to say, well, they're doing something. That was done then. Probably 20 years later, we still give the same excuses for your predecessors then reaching a deal. This was in Thabo Mbeki's period as president. He was dead against pursuing prosecutions. So we should also consider that. We also know that in the case of the director of public prosecutions at the time, and Zuma, Mbeki did not want it to proceed. So we
Can
have
I
all
ask
those.
you,
Yes.
Professor, let me interrupt you there. And I think this is a very important point. Why do you suppose Thabo Mbeki was dead against proceeding with these prosecutions?
Well, I think he's the one to answer that. I cannot say why, but I do know when Kulumani brought an action in, I think it was the New York Circuit Court. I could be wrong there, and there was another group that wanted justice. These are probably people counted in the stats that Ms. Shireen is giving. Um, he opposed it. The government opposed it. So something has happened there. And we're not getting, and the media is not following the money on this one. Because
So
why would you stop?
basically, yeah,
Yeah, why would you
Professor,
stop
what I'm
as head of state?
hearing, yeah, I'm hearing by his action way back then, Thabo Mbeki let he let down a whole host of activists,
No,
people
he let
that
down the
had
country and our history.
absolutely people like yourself that probably, gave most of your life to the struggle. You're one of the lucky ones. You survived. But how many of those have still not been accounted for? How many of those
Absolutely.
are still missing? How many of those families still don't know what happened to their loved
Sure,
ones?
sure.
So, actually, and I say this very boldly, that Thabo Mbeki has sold out the activists by
Well,
his
look,
action.
I don't know what agreement was reached in the smoky, dark rooms between those negotiators on the one side and the apartheid leaders on the other, where they drank their whiskey and smoked their cigars and their pipes and so on. Yeah, no, that literally happened from their own accounts. Um, you don't have to you don't have to have too much imagination on this one. uh,
Absolutely.
so um, and to go to the extent of saying to a court of law, no, it's not your problem, it is ours. It's the classic one that apartheid used to say to the rest of the world: this is an internal problem, we'll solve it. And when you have recourse to those companies that were being brought to account in the US and probably elsewhere would have been brought to account for aiding and abetting a criminal system like apartheid, a murderous one, then we're talking about the disappeared, we're talking about the murdered, we're talking about the maimed. Now, um, we are in a weird position, and Thabo Mbeki has found his voice recently, and maybe that's something he should be able to answer. He's very vocal on a lot of things, and this is something that I'm pretty certain those families, those people that went out there to do that and got, they probably crowdfunded and got other kinds of funding at the time. They were against an American system that wanted to protect their companies who were busting sanctions and aiding and abetting the apartheid regime. And we had the government that took over here, proclaiming democracy, proclaiming justice, proclaiming dignity, um, lets them down. Now, ironically, we have the same kind of situation with people who lost their lives for one reason or the other in different parts of the world, particularly north of our borders, in different African countries. And the number of bodies repatriated has been minute in the last 30 years. What do we find, Julie? Now, um, Minister Mackenzie has already brought a significant number of bodies back. And he's publicly committed that he will not rest till every single one of them is brought back. Their families have closure. They get a decent burial, and so on. Now, why do these kinds of things have to happen? And Minister Mackenzie was not involved in the liberation struggle. We were. Now you get somebody like that doing it, and you wonder how come our own guys who were prosecuting the liberation struggle can't do these things. So you see, there are all these complexities. There's hidden narratives, well, a clear agenda that we're not aware of. Who reached what agreement with who not to do these things? Or perhaps, people were terrified. And those kinds of things, I think many of us will understand. When you're tortured and you're confronted, as I was numerously, by 10 to 14 security policemen in my mother's lounge, surrounded by these burly guys, surrounded by them in the evening at the Commissioner of Police's headquarters, where all of them would converge on me, and you're alone. You are terrified. You are terrified, but you acknowledge that you're terrified. But you know what, Julie? I can tell you without fear of contradiction, those guys who did everything they could to all of us, underneath there were these insecure little men, even though there would have been many of them were over 6 foot tall. They were insecure and terrified that, would you not do to us what we have done to you? We've not done that. In fact, we're bending
Okay.
over backwards to protect them for some reason or the other.
Okay. I just, for a long while, since this genocide has been playing out on the Palestinian people for a long,
Mhm.
long while, and I think this is really another conversation that you and I need to have. Is I've been wondering about the conditioning and the psychology of these young IDF Israeli soldiers that go out and perpetrate the most heinous of acts on innocent women and children in Palestine. And the question I ask myself is, do they not have a conscience? Do they not have families? How do they sleep at night? And are we going to be seeing post this genocide and ethnic cleansing in Palestine? Are we going to see um, what America saw post Vietnam? A generation of very, very psychologically damaged young people and soldiers. I mean, I often look and think, what does an 18 or a 20-year-old understand about politics of the world and the wars that goes on in the world? And yet they are so conditioned that they go out and they carry out the most heinous of crimes ever. If you can just respond to me as shortly
Yeah.
as you possibly
Okay.
can, because I
Look,
think it is so important.
yeah. Look, there's something happens when brutality happens to you. I think their great grandparents who suffered during the Holocaust would be aghast if they knew their grandchildren, their great grandchildren were perpetrating this against anybody, because it's simply not on. I think the clear fact is there, there is a disjunct between one's sense of who one is versus the other. We see it in other contexts, but here it's stuck. What happens to somebody who is brutalized? But the interesting thing here, Julie, is most of these who are on the front lines, and we're seeing teenagers go in, especially in the last few weeks, into places and do these horrible things. These are not persons who are victims of that genocide. They are the progeny. So something in the socialization has happened. Something about being special also happens. And, there is a word that is used in Hebrew for segregation, and it's called hafrada. And maybe they just believe that they're superior. You will never ever lift your hand against somebody who you believe is a fellow human being. You have to dehumanize them. You have to reduce them to all kinds of name calling, make them animals, bestial. And actually, animals don't behave in that way. It's human beings who are responsible for the most carnage. And so something is happening in the psyche there. The issues you raise could probably already be at play in a siege mentality. When you feel, Sabra's persons born there feel everybody's against me, and that narrative perpetuates itself, then you feel that anybody who even vaguely raises a question is selling out. There are Jewish citizens of Israel. There are Jews elsewhere who have commented, written about this, and perhaps we should look to them for those answers, because this is a case study in such egregious self dehumanization, and in turn other dehumanization, as to be called genocide and agreed to by the International Court of Justice. So, it's something very important happens here when a term has been used only to portray the Holocaust, that there was a genocide, and we ignore the genocide of slavery, we ignore Rwanda, we ignore what's happening successively since the Nakba. That requires a deep discussion, because we need to understand that it's a pitiable condition for anybody to be there in that situation, because how do you see a threat with an unborn baby? It's all those kinds of things. A lot of
Absolutely.
issues are there, and that those need to be
Okay.
seriously unpacked. Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, we're going to have to leave this for another time and we delve very deeply into all of these issues, but we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, I still have two more interviews lined up. So thank you
Sure.
indeed for your deep insights on the TRC, on the closure as far as these people are still waiting for the payouts or whatever else needs to happen. And also, I digressed regarding the Palestinian issue, but I think it was a very, very
It's a very
important
germane
response
example. Yeah.
and a very important response that you provided there. So I thank you indeed. God bless and stay safe.
You
Thank you.
take care. Bye bye.
It is exactly 9:56 a.m. News and views moving along. Let me just quickly check with my controller. Are we going to Imran Chunara first, or are we going to the interview? Right. So I have some good news for you. We're going to take a listen to the Fired Up series with Hafiz Imran Chunara, personal excellence mentor and CEO of Africa Muslims Agency. And he's going to talk about old age just brings old age, not wisdom, says Imran Chunara. Let's take a listen.